All right, welcome everybody as you are all logging on. We're going to wait until we have a quorum of people attending. We had 60 people or so sign up for this webinar, which is very exciting. All right, 23 and counting. We'll give people just a couple more minutes. As I had mentioned earlier, there were about 60 people who signed up for the webinar, so you might want to wait until we hit at least 30 or a little bit more than that. And we have one person calling in, but most of the rest of you appear to be on video. We will be sharing slides in this webinar. So if you did not have a chance to see the slides in the webinar, as you might know, we typically send the slides out and or a recording of the webinar after it's completed. So you'll have a chance to see the slides one way or another. All right, so we have hit the magic number of 30, and I think I might take the liberty of going ahead and starting. Wanted to welcome you all to this webinar about reopening responsibly. We want to share our own experience running the Jessie, located here in Jacksonville, Florida. We have closed down the Jessie as of the middle of March, have not reopened it, and have been really thinking through all the issues involved in opening up a space where 200 tenants are in the building. So we've been thinking through all these issues, and we figured we might share our experience with you all, and especially that we might be able to share some of the outside expertise we've had the benefit of, so that you might all also benefit from it as well. Just a couple of administrative notes. We will take questions and answers. I'd like to suggest that you keep an eye on the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen, typically. And if questions occur to you as you are listening to the presentation, please put your question in there. That way we'll be able to pick them up at the end of the discussion and start answering them. The chat function is there primarily for troubleshooting. We'd like to keep the Q&A inside the Q&A box, because there's actually a cool way for us to actually show the questions have been answered and move on from them. But otherwise, I think it should be fairly self-explanatory. I am now going to introduce the panelists and let you take it all away from there. Mark Walker, who will be speaking first, the director of the Jessie and the senior program officer at the Jessie Ball duPont Fund. Many of you are probably familiar with Mark. Amanda Davis, the manager of the Jessie, who works for CBRE, who is in fact the professional folks who actually know how to run a building and is resident in our building. And Mike, our chief engineer, who does an amazing job keeping us safe and provided for and comfortable, is also available on this webinar. And finally, Austin Hamilton, a lawyer at Jemerson Burr and who will be able to sort of provide the legal perspective of what is involved in reopening our buildings. So with that, Mark, please take it away.
Thanks, Mari. So for those of you who haven't been to Jacksonville downtown and seen our building since we opened it in 2015, this in front of you is the Jesse, really the Jesse Ball DuPont Center. It's now affectionately known as the Jesse as of this year. It's 125,000 square foot, 4-story building when you count the below ground level in downtown Jacksonville. We house 19 tenants here that vary in size from a couple offices that have 1 employee to our anchor tenant that has 70 employees that come here on a daily basis. So Mari also mentioned we went to a limited capacity in mid-March. It was actually the week of March 16th. That was advance of any stay-at-home orders from local and state government in Florida by about 2 weeks. We've never technically closed the building. We've operated at what we call limited capacity throughout the last 2 months. So on average, we're seeing about 10 or less employees that are accessing the Jesse daily to check mail, run checks, or other essential functions that they can't perform at home. Here's a couple pictures of the inside of the building. You can see we have a lot of shared space. That's one of our challenges as we start to figure out how to reopen, is how to manage this shared space safely for our clients, tenants, and their visitors. So the move into the limited capacity was done in concert with our tenants. And it was adjusted for each organization's unique operating situation. And throughout the last 2 months, we've remained in close contact with the leadership at these organizations, providing updates, sharing our resources as we have them. We've recently begun a conversation with tenant leaders on reopening responsibly and what that looks like for the Jesse and its tenants. And that's some of what we're going to be sharing with you today. So for each organization, this looks slightly different, as you can imagine, based on their physical footprint, the services that they are providing, and if those continue to be a viable option for continuing to serve remotely. And internal and external considerations. So, there's a lot as you're thinking about reopening the building that you have to consider internally and from external sources. So does your physical environment at your building support social distancing and frequent cleaning? As you can see, my colleagues Amanda and Mike are in the same room, but socially distanced. I'm also in the building today in a public area, so I have my face mask on. The availability of widespread testing. We are hearing a lot about testing. Jacksonville is doing a decent job ramping testing up, but like most places, we still aren't there yet. And how are we going to monitor those with COVID-19 symptoms that are coming into the building? Reliable and sustainable availability of key supplies, which Amanda's going to touch on. And also for our tenants, the key support businesses. What about childcare? A lot of places aren't reopening for childcare even after the school year. So what happens for employees there? The regulatory requirements, implementation of compliant practices according to any requirements from local, state, and federal government or health organizations. And then something Austin's going to touch on when he's speaking, which is the liability issues that are facing us all as we consider reopening. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Amanda. I'll talk to y'all in a little bit, but I'm going to pass it over to Amanda and Mike.
Hi, thanks for having us here. We're happy to kind of share some of the resources that we have and what our plan is over here at the Jesse. I work for CBRE as a real estate manager. I manage the Jesse here. Mike and myself have been here since day one. Mike has been with CB for 20 years, and he is a wealth of knowledge when it comes to the mechanical and technical expertise. So we're going to go over just kind of how we're breaking this down into 4 areas, breaking it into base building, general building operations, crisis management, and building amenities. So when you're considering your base building, you really need to think about your HVAC, your electrical, your fire, life safety, elevators, escalators. So what we're looking at in these areas is really making sure all of your vendors who are coming in to perform work, because typically you'd hire people to come in and work on these systems, that they're wearing PPE, making sure they're following guidelines and being safe in your space. But you also need to consider, is this work that needs to be done right now? Is that opening us up for risk having these vendors on site? Or is this a good time for them to do work in the building while the building's empty? We have kind of taken a dual approach with that. There are certain things that we're having done because it's empty, it's a safe time for us to work and get projects done. And then certain items we don't see a need to have done right this second. Depending on what kind of HVAC system you have, you want to look at what may be the recommendations. I know right now currently MERV 14 filters or higher being recommended. There's also some interesting technology with UV lighting that disinfect and kill bacteria on your coils in your systems. Fire life safety is also an interesting one because you really want to look at your entrances and your exits of your building. And if you're trying to prop open doors so people aren't touching as many door handles, is that presenting life safety issues? Is that going to be something that is going to come up in a building code issue with the fire marshal? And then elevators and escalators, you want to limit riders. You want to make sure you're leaving space for people to enter and exit off these elevators, marking the floors, and really looking at, how do we eliminate touch points. You'll see on the screen right now, there is this nanoseptic surface. There's some new technology that uses oxidation to kill organic materials on surfaces. They have these for elevator button covers as well as door handles and other items. With this saying, this is not a replacement of cleaning, but it is new technology that's supposed to be helping to eliminate some of the germ spreading. So this is something at the Jessie we are utilizing and we have ordered to utilize, but this will not take the place of cleaning that surface or disinfecting it regularly. For your building, general building operations, you want to really look at your entrances and exits like we spoke about earlier, but also screening, your security or concierge, if you call it that, janitorial, restrooms. Having a dedicated exit and entrance is really key right now. The goal is to really limit the number of touch points. So if you can effectively disinfect those areas throughout the day, so having a clear traffic flow that you can see will really help you guys to figure out what areas do you need to focus on most throughout the day to properly clean it and sanitize. You can see some of the pictures on the screen right now from our building that we are showing that we do require you to wear a face mask in any public area in the building. We also have some elevator signage that says, please don't crowd, limiting riders. I will say with screening, it presents challenges. So we're utilizing PPE. We have not made the choice to screen people actively as they come through the facility. That's something we will consider, continue to consider, but the most effective form of prevention right now in our mind is to continue to utilize PPE in those areas. And then if you can go touchless, you can see our touchless paper towel dispenser in the top right-hand corner. We are changing out all of our items in our restrooms to try and limit touch points. So currently we have touchless paper towels as well as soap dispensers, but we're looking to change out our toilets to automatic flushers as well as our faucets to automatic touchless faucets as well. So if you have the flexibility or the means to be able to do that, it's another great option to kind of help limit some of those touch points. And then we're going to also talk a little bit about kind of crisis management. It's really important to know business continuity plans and have emergency contacts listed and have communication with those. Mark is going to talk a little bit more about this at this point and why this constant communication is important.
Yeah, as I stated up front in the webinar in the first couple of slides, the most important aspect in this current crisis is clear and frequent communication. And what we've found with our tenants, they value understanding and hearing the plans of their peers as they consider reopening. This helps them make a case for their own plans to their own boards. It helps provide best practices for how to scale reentry, and it provides a willing set of ears to bounce ideas off of. So I don't want to, but there's so much happening to these organizations right now that they're almost in a bubble trying to, handle their day-to-day business model. So having that time to be able to step outside of that with their peer group and start to get a broader understanding of how everyone's dealing with trying to figure out how to re-enter together has been a real value for them, so much so that they've asked for us to help continue that for them. So I can't stress enough regular contact and communication with leadership that you're working with, and making sure that that's a continuous part of the feedback loop that you have going, because it really makes a difference.
So you will see here, we have some sanitation stations that we put up. So this is also, we have a lot of shared areas, and you have building amenities as well. So there's a few challenges with cleaning. Right now, you may have trouble sourcing cleaning products. That is what we're hearing from numerous organizations. So getting creative is really key here, utilizing relationships you have with vendors. So we've reached out to our janitorial suppliers, our janitorial company who cleans the facility, and they have really great relationships with these suppliers because they order large quantities for numerous buildings that they clean. So we were able to leverage that relationship and get some supplies that we were showing out of stock on our end. So getting creative with that. Also, any cleaners you're using should have a quad ingredient in it. That quad is what is recommended by the CDC to kill the coronavirus. A lot of the stuff you see on the market is sold out currently, but if you look at the concentrate quad cleaners, they're still in stock. So if you can dilute those on site, have your janitorial company work on diluting those and using those as cleaners, there's creative ways to get things that you may currently be out of stock. So look at the resources, look at what you're buying, and oftentimes buying the concentrate is cheaper and more affordable as well. You can see our entrances. We have blue arrows marking in and out in the top right-hand corner. And then also at the front door, because we have visitors and shared space, we have an intercom system, and that is connected to our front desk area. So our security officer will be able to speak to people without having to come in contact with them, figure out what they're here for, where they need to go, assess that, and then let them into the facility by pressing a button to unlock the front door. We are keeping our facility locked over the next month or so. We think it is the best way to control traffic. All of our employees have key fobs to enter the building, so they can access the building utilizing their key fob. And then that way we can limit guests coming in the facility unless they are here and have an appointment. We do recommend, if you're going to require PPE in your facility, that you provide some kind of training. There's a lot of training on the CDC as well as OSHA, but you need to make sure people are utilizing PPE correctly. We see a lot of people wearing face masks and having them below their chin. Mark is doing a great job modeling a proper usage of a face mask for you right now. But you also want to focus on those high touch points. So you can see that one way will be the entrance that people will come in. And that way, our janitorial crew and our day porters here during the day will know, okay, those door handles, that is what I need to make sure we're constantly touching. I'm constantly using a disinfectant on that area. But with all of this being said, you can plan as much as you would like, but you may still have a positive case come into your facility. There's always going to be a risk because asymptomatic people can spread the disease. So with that being said, there's going to be an issue. So we recommend you guys have relationships with vendors in place to perform a cleaning. You may get a positive case, and that's why it's really important to have that business continuity plan from your tenants and those emergency contacts. You need to know how are you properly going to notify everybody, what's the chain of command, who do you notify when, and then what are your steps on making sure that area is properly sanitized and cleaned after a positive case is reported. So having vendors in line and relationships built in with groups like ServPro, they will be able to basically give you a quote, give you a price, have them in place. So if the need does arise, it's quick and you won't see any delay in getting them in on-site cleaning. So we recommend doing that in advance. But with all this being done, there is going to be risk. The best thing we can do is try and mitigate that risk, try and do what we can to keep the employees, the tenants, and the clients in our facilities safe. And we're going to let Austin Hamilton, who's a partner at Jimerson Burr, talk a little bit more about the liability piece that comes along with that.
Sure. Thank you, Amanda. And thanks for allowing me to be here. So I identified a couple topics that I thought would be of particular interest. The first is the responsibilities that commercial building owners and managers have to protect tenants upon reentry. The first step in performing that analysis is to see whether there's a contractual obligation. That's likely going to be found in the lease agreement. The lease agreement typically will provide the landlord's obligations. It will identify obligations with regard to the common areas versus the tenant premises. It will also identify the landlord's ability to implement reasonable rules and regulations. And the second part of the analysis is really asking yourself, what is commercially reasonable under the circumstances? And that's really going to be unique for each building. The specific needs will vary building by building. It will vary based upon the location, whether it's a rural area or an urban area. Contacting and following CDC guidelines, OSHA guidelines, local health department guidelines, those are going to be the best bet. And, prudent owners and prudent managers at a minimum will implement some safety procedures. It's going to show that the landlord or the manager has taken reasonable steps to encourage safety, and there's no guaranteed safeguard. There's no way to 100% prevent liability. Landlords, what they need to do is they need to prepare themselves to mitigate the risk and to mitigate that exposure. And that includes communication. I think Mark touched on this earlier. I think communication is key. Communication between the landlord and the tenant as to what the landlord is doing to provide a safe facility, and what response the landlord is receiving from the tenants. If tenants do not object to the steps that are taken by the landlord, then it's going to be harder later on for a tenant to complain that those steps were not reasonable. And another thing along with communication is documentation. Document what you are doing to ensure, to take safety precautions, and what steps have been communicated to tenants and to others. The second part of what I wanted to discuss, and I'll try to keep it brief so we can move into the question and answer session, is I've received a lot of questions with regard to tenant requests for rent concessions. And the elephant in the room is really, is rent still due? And the answer is typically yes. The negotiating strength and considerations for both the landlord and the tenant will depend upon the language in the lease agreement. A clause that, if you haven't heard of, you probably will hear of, is called a force majeure clause. A force majeure clause is going to be one of the primary clauses to look at in the lease agreement. You need to look to see how broad it is, and what exactly it says. Typically, a force majeure clause will excuse performance obligations, but not payment obligations, because typically the inability to pay is not a force majeure event. A couple other clauses to pay attention to would be the covenant of quiet enjoyment, and also whether there's a clause requiring the landlord to provide uninterrupted services. And so landlords and tenants both need to look at the lease agreement, and they need to determine their bargaining power and the strengths and weaknesses of their positions based upon the lease agreement. And from the tenant perspective, communication with the landlord is key. And the tenant needs to be reasonable with the requests that are being made. I don't think it's reasonable just to say, I shouldn't have to pay rent, but making a suggestion to the landlord and understanding the landlord itself has obligations to pay vendors, to pay the mortgage, whatever the case may be, and finding a way that both the tenant and the landlord can agree upon, such as a deferral for a few months, spreading the couple months of payments over the remainder of the lease term, etc. And then lastly, from the landlord's perspective, I usually say for the landlord to analyze each tenant individually, look at the tenant's repayment history, long-term viability of the tenant, the lease term, and the remaining amount due under the lease. And so with that said, I'm happy to answer any questions once we get to the Q&As, and I will turn it back over to Mark.
Great, thanks so much. You can see many of us are facing the same challenges. This pandemic is a constantly moving target. It changes not just by the day, but sometimes by the hour and minute, what we are learning and hearing from folks. And this is having budget implications on the organizations that are tenants here at the Jesse, as well as the Jesse's budget to operate itself. And That said, you know, I think that there's sometimes a silver lining, you know, to all of these challenges that we face. There's opportunities we can explore. Empty and limited capacity buildings present great opportunities for catching up on deferred maintenance, accelerating your capital improvements, tightening up operating procedures. And limited use buildings can also present opportunities on how you engage with your local community as a resource during COVID-19. You know, so for example, actually here beginning tomorrow, in partnership with Catholic Charities, which is one of our tenants, and Farm Share, we're going to open a 5-day-a-week drive-through pantry that's going to serve 300 families a day or 1,500 families a week for the next 4 weeks. 1.5 blocks away, the city of Jacksonville is doing a stimulus package with local residents that make $75,000 or less combined as a family. So there's 1,500 families downtown collecting funds. And so it's a great opportunity for us to also leverage our space and our relationships to provide more resources for these families in their time of need. Because as we all know, it's not just a health pandemic, but it's a growing economic pandemic as well. So, you know, I encourage you to think about your places. You hear us talk more and more at the fund about equity and placemaking, and think about your places and opportunities you can take to make them great places, even in this difficult time. So with that, we're gonna go into the Q&A. So I'm gonna hand it over to Melanie, who's our moderator for questions, and we'll launch into that. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks everybody for joining us. We have our Q&A box open, so if you have questions about any of the topics we've covered or anything else that is related to reopening your facilities, we're happy to take those in the Q&A box. We did get a few just before the webinar, so we can kick off with those while everybody thinks about their questions. One of the questions that we got, and maybe Amanda, you can kick this one off. Do you have any recommendations for how to handle issues with people not adhering to mandatory building safety measures? Like if you're suggesting or requiring mask wearing, how would you handle it if you were running into non-adherence issues?
So this is what's really important about having a good dialogue with the tenants and the people who are occupying your building. We have been in contact with all the leadership for our 19 tenants, and they all are in agreement that PPE should be worn within the common spaces of the facility. So my first suggestion would be talking to their employer, their leadership, making sure that they are hearing the message from their leadership first, because they really should be communicated down. And if you have the employer and the leadership, their CEOs buy-in on this, getting people to follow the rules is going to be a little bit easier. So I would suggest making sure that you're communicating with leadership. These decisions are being agreed upon as a whole, and it's communicated out to their staff. And then so you're not in the position of having your security having to, you can remind people to wear a mask, but if you're having issues, pick it up with their leadership and have them address it with them directly.
And Melanie, if I could, I think I could add some value to that question as well. And that is, you know, from a legal perspective, I touched on this briefly, that is that typically in a lease agreement, the landlord's able to implement reasonable rules and regulations. And presumably the rules and regulations could include the requirement to wear PPE, and you know, potentially the landlords can send a default notice to a tenant who's refusing to cooperate with that, and hopefully that won't happen. I mean, hopefully Amanda's right, and you know, the communication between the landlord and the tenants will all be on the same wavelength. But there could be some tenants that you just don't want to abide by that, and so an option would be, you know, to implement a reasonable rule and regulation for the common area space, and then to potentially try to use more aggressive measures if that's needed, and hopefully it's not.
Great, thank you. Mark, I'm going to ask you to look at this next question based on the experience you had with developing the plan for the Jessie. How do we know when we're ready to start reopening, even in a phased or low occupancy way? Maybe you can talk through some of the decision points that you and the team have looked at as you've thought about reopening the building.
Sure. So we've really focused on, the health recommendations and the recommendations from the scientific community as we closed the building and, well, went to limited capacity. I don't want to say closed because we've never formally closed. And as we look at, a re-entry, we're continuing to pay attention to those things. It's not that we don't pay attention to the local, state, and federal directives, but our concentration is going to stay on the health side of the equation. That said, there is a push, and it's palpable in Florida from the state and local governments to start to reopen, and that's because of their economic consequences of this pandemic as well. And so that pressure is coming upon our tenants as well, and so we are looking, as we continue to look at reopening, how can we do this in the safest way possible for the people that have needs to be in this space to function and for their essential services. And so that is the balance that we're trying to strike, balancing those health recommendations with the needs of our tenants and communicating again with them one-on-one as a group as well, but also individually one-on-one with those tenants in what their actual needs are and how we can best meet those needs. And so with our client serving folks, we have very different conversations than we do with our admin only offices that are here. A lot of those admin only offices can come back in a limited capacity and are able to adequately use social distancing, and some are using PPE in their offices as well as in the common spaces. So those are relatively easy cases. Our client serving organizations present a different set of challenges. And so really focusing in on those unique challenges of each organization and how you can help them be successful and keep your building safe, their employees safe, their visitors safe, their clients safe is key. Balancing all of those pieces. I hope that answered the question, Melanie.
Yes, and piggybacking on that, if an organization is dealing with limited budget, as many are with lowered fundraising and options like that, do you, Mark or Amanda, have recommendations about how to prioritize some of those decisions? Obviously, you'd want to take care of all of the measures that you've outlined that we've done at the Jessie, but are there ways to prioritize some of those things to match lowered budgets?
Amanda, you're muted.
Okay, I'm unmuted. I would say if you're operating at a limited capacity, currently right now, we are only running our HVAC system in the building between 10 a.m. and 2 p.m. We're letting essential personnel who need to come into the building to come in. Normally our AC runs from 7 to 7, Monday through Friday. So we're seeing quite a bit in electricity savings right there. And I think you could put in place some of those items as well. Look at your janitorial contract. If there's going to be areas of the building that are going to be locked and unable to be used, should you be paying the square footage nightly for that cleaning area, or can you redirect that money to clean the common areas, the areas in the building that are going to be used? So I would say trying to get creative with what's needed. You have quarterly window cleaning contract. Couldn't you skip a quarter of window cleaning and utilize that funds for a different area? So I would say for priority though, is really going to be cleaning. That's going to be your biggest area that you need to focus on. As much as the touchless items are great and all of that, if you don't have the budget to do that, your money should be focused on cleaning throughout the day, having either a day porter on site, depending on how many people you have and your ability, and then the nighttime cleaning. You want areas of high traffic to be disinfected numerous times a day. And I would say that would be where I would focus my money if budgetary restrictions were in place, and also decreasing HVAC time that the air is running and things of that nature to help with the cost as well.
Yeah, and one of the things that Amanda's been doing for reopening that kind of plays into this too is as we're talking to each of these tenants individually and understanding what it's going to look like for them. Are they going to come back at all? Are they going to come back on certain days? Are they coming back every day, so that we can essentially create a matrix of who's in the building when, and we can, if Nonprofit Center, one of our tenants, is looking at possibly not coming back for quite a while because they've moved all their trainings to online platforms, it doesn't make sense for our cleaning crew to be in that office. So Amanda's can redirect that cleaning crew to other parts of the building. So, having a matrix of how to use your resources in the best way and deploy them in the best way possible, so you're not wasting those resources, is important too. And that comes back to that communication side.
Yeah, and with, so we're using nonprofit as an example, this is not their schedule, but if they were saying, we're going to continue working remotely and coming in on Tuesdays to check mail and run checks, and then we would make sure janitorial is doing cleaning and sanitation of their suite that Tuesday night, but is it really necessary to be doing it 5 days a week if no one's there? Can we redirect those resources to a better place on these other evenings?
Excellent. Thanks for those specific examples. We just got a question about churches and places of worship. Are there specific thoughts on churches or other places of worship?
I know Mari we have a CDC document that was released that does have specifics on churches and places of worship. I would recommend looking at that document. The thing, churches and places of worship is very much like our shared spaces here at the Jessie. So they present challenges because you do have quite a bit of people in an area usually close in proximity. I would say if you were to reopen a place of worship, making sure that you are marking seats to keep social distancing in place. We've seen a lot of successes with virtual services as well. There is a drive-in theater here in Florida that is doing showings on Sundays of the church. They're broadcasting out that way. So I think there's some creative ways to look at that, but really making sure their areas are cleaned and limiting touch points in those areas. I would recommend propping doors open and prior to the service starting, so not so many people are touching those doors. Thinking of, how are you limiting that? Also, if you're giving or receiving communion, that could also come with concerns as well. But I would say, look at the CDC's document that they put out. There's some specifics there that are pretty helpful.
Yeah, and just to note that we will be distributing that document along with other resources after this webinar. So we'll make sure you have access to it.
Yeah, and one of the things that we've mentioned is we've decided to focus on PPE here versus temperature checks, because there's so many folks that are catching from asymptomatic carriers. So thinking about PPE, if you're, along with your social distancing inside of your space, is going to be important. It's about protecting the person that's next to you, not necessarily yourself. And so this is a thing that we can all do, wearing this PPE. It's not comfortable. It's not, it obscures your face and your facial expressions, but it does protect your neighbor.
Yeah, and just briefly, I agree with all of that, and I would say just developing a plan and executing that plan and relying upon CDC guidelines and other guidelines, and ensuring that you have that plan in place, and hopefully communicating that to anyone who comes.
Thank you. We're going to make a call for any last questions via the Q&A box. One last one that came in while we were talking. Amanda, you mentioned forming relationships now with certain vendors. We can imagine that they're probably all very busy responding to a lot of similar requests to form those relationships. Do you have recommendations for how to do that? Or are you finding that there is enough capacity among high demand vendors to be able to service all of the need?
So there is definitely enough vendors. I've heard from all of our vendors reaching out to see if we need additional resources or supplies, but also the people like ServPro or Puro Clean or those larger agencies, they are, this is what they train for. You know, they do the same thing when a hurricane is coming. You know, they're prepped and ready for restoration and cleaning. This is what they're here for. They pull resources from other areas, and they are all ready to go. Every person I've been in contact with has been more than happy to come to the facility, to meet, to look and get ready ahead of time, because most of these people want to prevent getting a last minute kind of fire drill call of, oh my gosh, we have a confirmed case, can you get over here? We need to look at the facility. If they already have the information ahead of time, it's as easy as, okay, we already have the information, we know who to bill. Okay, let's just deploy the services. We're familiar with the space. So most organizations you'll find will be happy to come ahead of time and start that process with you, because it's going to be easier on them when they do need to deploy their services.
Great, thank you. It looks like we have answered all the questions from the Q&A box and all of the questions that came in before the webinar. So Mari, I will turn it back over to you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Melanie. And thank you to all the people who tuned in, but especially to Amanda, Mike, and Austin, and Mark for having led us in this webinar. We hope it was helpful. I know that it was a very specific use case of an office building in downtown Jacksonville. And as we just saw in some of the Q&A, the questions, your mileage may vary and your questions may be more specific. But as I mentioned, there are some resources out there that answer those very much more specific questions. The CDC document that we referenced was developed in consultation with faith leaders as well as with local and state leaders. So we think it might be really helpful for you to take a look at that document. As always, thank you for your patience with us doing all of these things virtually. And we hope to see many more of you soon in other webinars that we run. Thank you very much.